You had breakfast this morning. Maybe cereal. Maybe yogurt with some granola on top. Maybe toast with a glass of orange juice. And you probably felt pretty good about it. Responsible. You read the label, saw the words low fat, nodded, put it in your cart. You've been doing this your whole life. Now look at the yogurt. Flip it over. Find the line that says total sugars. That low-fat vanilla yogurt you've been eating has 26, 27, sometimes 28 grams of sugar in a single serving. Nearly 7 teaspoons. More sugar than a chocolate-frosted donut. But it says low-fat, so it must be healthy, right? Somebody decided, decades before you were born, that fat was the thing killing people, that fat caused heart disease, that fat made you fat, and an entire country rearranged its food supply around that idea. Your grocery store is organized around it. Your school lunches were designed around it. The nutrition label on every product you've ever bought was formatted around it. And that decision, the one that shaped how 300 million people eat, can be traced back to a specific project, funded by a specific industry group, carried out by 3 specific scientists at Harvard in 1965. They were paid to write it. The sugar industry told them what conclusion to reach, and when they delivered, the industry's own director of research wrote back and said, "This is quite what we had in mind." The lead scientist on that project was a man named D. Mark Hegsted. Remember that name, because in about 20 minutes you're going to understand why it matters more than almost anyone in the history of American nutrition. First, I want to show you the world they built, because you're living in it right now. You're eating inside it, and you probably don't even know the walls are there. And I'm going to show you exactly who did this to you. Go to any grocery store, any one. Walk to the dairy section and start counting the products that say low-fat or fat-free. You'll be there a while. Yogurt, milk, cheese, sour cream, cottage cheese. Then the snack aisle, the dressing aisle, the cereal aisle, the frozen meals. The entire store is built around the assumption that fat is dangerous and less fat means healthier. That assumption runs so deep in the infrastructure that you don't even register it anymore. This started in the late 1970s. In 1977, a Senate committee led by George McGovern released something called the Dietary Goals for the United States. First time the federal government told Americans to eat less of specific things. The biggest target was fat. The report recommended 55 to 60% of calories from carbohydrates and less than 30% from fat. Think about what that does to the food industry. Suddenly, every company in America needs to reformulate. Every product needs to show it's getting with the program. Low fat becomes a marketing advantage. Fat becomes the enemy on every nutrition label. And if you're a food company that doesn't reformulate, you look like the one that doesn't care about health. You lose shelf space, you lose contracts with school districts and hospital cafeterias. The incentive wasn't just to follow the guidelines. The incentive was that everyone who didn't would be punished by the market. In 1980, the first official dietary guidelines for Americans reinforced it. Cut fat, cut saturated fat, cut cholesterol, eat more grains, more cereals, more bread, more pasta. The food pyramid that showed up in every classroom and every doctor's office in the 1990s had grains at the base, 6 to 11 servings a day, and fats? Tiny triangle at the top, used sparingly, like they were a controlled substance. Now here's the problem nobody talked about. When you take fat out of food, it tastes awful. Fat carries flavor. Fat gives yogurt its richness, gives cookies their texture, gives salad dressing its body. Without fat, you're eating flavored cardboard. The food industry knew this. They couldn't sell products that tasted like nothing. So they solved the problem the cheapest way they knew how. They added sugar. And not a little bit. Because sugar is cheap, it's shelf-stable, and it lights up your brain's reward system in a way that makes you reach for a second helping. Food scientists have a term for the exact concentration of sugar that maximizes how much you enjoy a product. They call it the bliss point. Not too little, not too much. The precise level that makes your brain say, yes, more of that. A researcher named Howard Moskowitz spent decades mapping bliss points for major food companies, Pepsi, Campbell's, dozens of others. His method was systematic. Test dozens of sugar concentrations with hundreds of people, graph the results, find the peak. That peak is the bliss point. Once you find it, you lock it in. Every batch, every production run, every unit on the shelf is calibrated to hit that exact spot in your nervous system. This wasn't a secret side project. This was the entire business model. Remove the fat because the government says fat is bad. Add sugar to replace the taste. Optimize the sugar level to the bliss point. Put a health claim on the front of the box. Charge more because it's healthy. Snackwell's launched in 1992. Fat-free cookies, devil's food cake, vanilla cream, shortbread, marketed as the guilt-free snack, and people went insane for them. Nabisco did $490 million in Snackwell's revenue by 1995. People would show up at grocery stores and buy every box on the shelf. There are stories of delivery trucks being swarmed. A single serving of those vanilla creme cookies had 17 grams of sugar. A regular Snickers bar has 20, but they said fat-free on the box, so people ate entire sleeves, 3, 4, 5 servings in a sitting, because their government, their doctors, and the labels all told them fat was the problem. These had no fat, so they must be fine. And this is where it gets worse, because Snackwell's wasn't the end of the sugar creep. It was the beginning. It was proof of concept. A company could take out the fat, dump in sugar, slap a health claim on the box, and watch it fly off the shelves. Every food executive in the country saw those numbers. $490 million for cookies. Once food companies realized that sugar could replace fat and still carry a health label, the reformulation spread like a chain reaction. American bread got sweeter. Not because bread needs sugar, but because one brand figured out that a little sweetness made their loaf outsell the one next to it, so every other brand matched it. And then the new sweetness became the baseline, which meant the next brand had to go a little sweeter to stand out. If you've ever eaten bread in Europe and thought it tasted different, you weren't imagining it. You were tasting bread that never got pulled into that cycle. That cycle hit everything. Pasta sauce absorbed it next. A half cup of some popular tomato sauces contains 12 grams of sugar, 3 teaspoons, in a product that should be tomatoes, garlic, and olive oil. And once pasta sauce was sweet, the ketchup and barbecue sauces people ate alongside it had to keep pace. Some barbecue sauces now pack 16 grams of sugar into a 2-tablespoon serving, 4 teaspoons of sugar in 2 tablespoons of condiment. Your baseline for how food should taste was shifting under your feet, and you had no idea. By the time you were an adult, the sweetness level you thought was normal was the engineered version. Each product made the next one possible. Each reformulation raised the floor. And the labels kept saying healthy, low fat, reduced fat, fat-free. Those phrases didn't mean less sugar. They almost always meant more. But you'd never know unless you flipped the package over and read the number nobody was teaching you to look for. Meanwhile, the thing the low-fat revolution was supposed to fix? Heart disease? It didn't get fixed. Obesity went through the roof. In 1980, about 15% of American adults were obese. By the early 2000s, over 30%. By 2018, over 40%. The country did what it was told. It ate less fat, it ate more grains, it bought the low-fat products, and it got fatter and sicker than it had ever been. That was 1980. It's still happening right now. Somebody should have gone back and looked at the science that started all of this, at the original evidence that said fat was the enemy and sugar was fine. But nobody did. For 50 years. Because the science came from Harvard. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was endorsed by the United States government. You can't argue with credentials like that. Except you can, when you find the receipts. In the 1950s, there was a genuine scientific debate about what was causing the epidemic of heart disease in America. 2 camps. On one side, Ansel Keys, an American nutritionist at the University of Minnesota, who believed the culprit was dietary fat, specifically saturated fat and cholesterol. On the other side, John Yudkin, a British professor of nutrition at the University of London, who believed the culprit was sugar. Both men had data. Both had published extensively, but Keys was louder, more aggressive, more politically connected. He called Yudkin's work A mountain of nonsense. He attacked him personally at conferences. He used his influence to marginalize anyone who suggested sugar might be dangerous. Yudkin published a book in 1972 called Pure, White, and Deadly. He laid out the evidence that sugar consumption was directly linked to heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. The book was attacked. Yudkin was ridiculed. His career was effectively ended. The World Sugar Research Organization lobbied to block him from conferences. His research funding evaporated. Other scientists stopped citing his work, not because they disagreed, but because being associated with him had become professionally dangerous. And now we know the sugar industry was helping to make that happen. They didn't just fund their own science, they helped bury his. The Sugar Research Foundation was the industry's lobbying and research arm. Their vice president and director of research was a man named John Hickson. In 1964, Hickson wrote an internal memo proposing that the foundation embark on what he called a major program to counter negative attitudes toward sugar. His strategy was straightforward: fund research. Not research to find the truth, research, in his exact words, to refute our detractors. Yudkin was the detractor. His book was the threat. And while Hickson was planning how to neutralize him, he was also shopping for a louder voice, someone with credentials so heavy that Yudkin would disappear beneath them. In 1965, articles appeared in the Annals of Internal Medicine, linking sugar consumption to coronary heart disease. This was exactly what Hickson feared. He needed a response fast, something authoritative, something from an institution nobody would question. He went to Harvard. Of all the institutions in the world he could have chosen, he chose the one whose name alone would end the argument. Nobody second-guesses Harvard. That was the point. Hickson approached D. Mark Hegsted, a professor in the Department of Nutrition at Harvard's School of Public Health. The department was chaired by Frederick Stare, who was already sitting on the Sugar Research Foundation's Scientific Advisory Board. The sugar industry already had a relationship with this department. They already had access. The deal was this: the Sugar Research Foundation would pay Hegsted and his colleague Robert McGandy to write a literature review. Not original research, not experiments. Just look at the existing studies about sugar, fat, and heart disease and tell the world what they meant. The payment was $6,500 total, about $50,000 in today's money, split between the Harvard researchers, and they knew. Hegsted asked Hickson to send him the studies to review. The Sugar Research Foundation selected the articles. The industry whose product was under investigation got to choose the evidence that the Harvard reviewers would evaluate. They picked the studies, they handed them to the scientists, and they said, "Here, review these." The project was coded internally as Project 226. Over the next year, Hegsted and McGandy wrote and rewrote the review. Hickson received drafts along the way. He was tracking the progress. He was reading what they were producing. The paper that was supposed to be an independent academic review was being monitored by the industry that funded it. Then, in October 1966, the final draft arrived. Hickson read it, and on November 2nd, 1966, he wrote back to Hegsted with a line that sat buried in an archive for nearly 50 years. "This is quite what we had in mind, and we look forward to its appearance in print." The sugar industry's own director of research, writing to the Harvard professor he was paying, confirming that the paper met the industry's objectives. The review was published in 1967 in the New England Journal of Medicine. 2 parts. The authors listed were McGandy, Hegsted, and Stare. The paper concluded that the evidence connecting sugar to heart disease was limited, not convincing. Not strong enough to act on. Fat and cholesterol, on the other hand, solid, compelling, worth building policy around. Stanton Glantz, one of the researchers who exposed this decades later, described the method precisely. There was a double standard. Anything written against sugar was held to impossibly strict standards and ripped apart. Anything written against fat got a free pass. The same level of evidence that was deemed insufficient for sugar was treated as conclusive for fat. And the funding? The Sugar Research Foundation's involvement? Not mentioned. Not a single word. While this was happening, Yudkin was being systematically erased. The same institutions that elevated Hegsted's compromised review worked to make sure Yudkin's legitimate research never gained traction. His book was dismissed, his invitations to conferences dried up, his lab funding disappeared. He spent his final years watching the world adopt the exact dietary advice he had spent his career trying to prevent. You know what he did after that? Nothing, because there was nothing left to do. He died in 1995, largely forgotten. He didn't live to see his vindication. And now the part I told you we'd come back to. D. Mark Hegsted. The Harvard professor who took the sugar industry's money, who let them choose the studies he reviewed, who wrote the conclusions they wanted, who published it in the most respected medical journal in the country without disclosing who paid for it. You know what he did after that? He got promoted. In 1977, the Senate released its Dietary Goals for Americans, the document that told the country to cut fat and eat more carbohydrates, the document that launched the entire low-fat era. The scientific framework behind it was heavily influenced by Hegsted's work. Then, in 1978, Hegsted was appointed as the first administrator of human nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture, put in charge of creating federal nutritional policy. He helped produce the 1980 dietary guidelines, the ones that told the country to reduce fat, reduce saturated fat, reduce cholesterol, the ones that became the foundation for the food pyramid, the ones that reshaped the entire American food system. The man who buried sugar's connection to heart disease on behalf of the industry that paid him was given the job of telling 300 million Americans what to eat, and the guidelines he shaped told them to do exactly what the sugar industry wanted: fear fat, ignore sugar. And they knew. Hegsted was fired when Reagan took office, but the guidelines survived. Every administration after that built on the framework he created: the food pyramid, the school lunch programs, the hospital meal plans, the nutrition labels, all of it resting on a foundation that was compromised from the start. None of this came out until September 2016. A researcher named Kristen Kearns at the University of California, San Francisco published a paper in JAMA Internal Medicine. Her co-authors were Laura Schmidt and Stanton Glantz. They had spent years in archives. They found over 340 internal documents from the sugar industry, 1,582 pages of letters, memos, financial records, and internal correspondence. And those documents proved that the scientific consensus pointing at fat and away from sugar was not something researchers arrived at independently. It was purchased. That was 2016. Hegsted died in 2009, 7 years too early to answer a single question. He never had to explain why the sugar industry's director of research called his Harvard review quite what we had in mind. He never stood in front of a camera and accounted for the 50 years of wrong dietary advice that flowed from his work. Nobody ever asked him, and now nobody can. The man who shaped how America eats died without ever being held accountable for the industry money that shaped how he worked. So you know all of this now. You've heard the names. You've read the documents. You know the review was funded by the sugar industry, that the studies were selected by the sugar industry, that the conclusions were approved by the sugar industry, that the man who wrote them helped design the dietary guidelines for the entire country, and that another scientist who tried to tell the truth was destroyed for it. You know the science was corrupted. You know the guidelines were wrong. You know the food industry used the low-fat panic to pump sugar into everything you eat. And none of that knowledge will change what you taste tomorrow morning. That's the deepest part of this story. The manipulation didn't just happen in a Harvard lab or a Senate hearing room. It happened in your mouth, in your nervous system, in the version of normal that was installed in you before you were old enough to choose. Your brain on sugar is doing something very specific. When sugar hits your tongue, it triggers a dopamine release in the same reward center that responds to nicotine, alcohol, and cocaine. Same part of the brain, same chemical, same basic signal that says, do that again. A team at Princeton found that rats given intermittent access to sugar develop binging behavior. They show signs of withdrawal when it's removed. Their brain chemistry changes in ways that mirror what you see with addictive drugs. A separate study out of France found that when rats were given a choice between intravenous cocaine and sugar water, the majority chose sugar. That study has been debated, and the comparison to human addiction is more complicated than a single experiment can prove. But the pattern keeps showing up. Sugar activates your reward system with a consistency that the food industry understood and exploited long before the rest of us caught on. And the dose was set in your childhood. Whatever you ate between ages 2 and 10 established your baseline. Your sense of what food should taste like was calibrated during those years. And during those years, you were eating the post-1980 American food supply. The one redesigned around the lie that fat was killing you and sugar was fine. The one where every product had been reformulated, sweetened, and optimized to hit the bliss point. Your school lunch followed the dietary guidelines. Your parents bought low-fat because their doctor told them to. The cereal you poured every morning was engineered to a bliss point you never chose. Nobody asked your permission. You were 3 years old. Your palate was being shaped by policy decisions made before you were born, funded by an industry that knew exactly what it was doing. You can't just decide to taste things differently. You can read every article about the sugar cover-up. You can memorize every name and date in this story, and you'll still find unsweetened yogurt genuinely unpleasant. Not because there's something wrong with you, because your taste receptors were shaped by 5 decades of corrupted nutritional policy. That's not a personal failing. That's infrastructure. And you see this play out in real time if you ever try to cut sugar. People who go cold turkey report headaches, irritability, fatigue, mood swings. The same cluster of symptoms you see with nicotine withdrawal. Not as severe, but the same category. Your body adapted to a constant supply of something that triggers a reward response, and when you remove it, your system protests. Think about what that means. The sugar industry didn't just corrupt a research paper in 1967. They didn't just mislead the dietary guidelines in 1980. They changed the physical wiring of your reward system. The fraud didn't stay on paper. It got into your cells. And removing it requires fighting your own biology. Biology that was shaped by a lie you never knew existed. That's not a metaphor, that's pharmacology. And that's just one company, one industry, one set of documents. Because the sugar industry didn't invent this playbook, but they proved it could work. And once they proved it, everyone copied it. The tobacco industry used the same strategy for decades. Fund studies that create doubt about the link between cigarettes and cancer, publish review papers that emphasize uncertainty, hire scientists with real credentials to attach their names to industry-friendly conclusions. Kearns and her colleagues noted the parallels explicitly in their 2016 paper. The fossil fuel industry did it with climate science. Fund enough counter-research, sponsor enough reviews that say the evidence is inconclusive, and eventually the public gets confused enough to do nothing. Pharmaceutical companies have done it with drug safety data. Chemical manufacturers have done it with pesticide research. You don't have to prove your product is safe. You just have to make the science look uncertain. That's the lesson the Sugar Research Foundation taught every industry on Earth with something to hide. That was the 1960s. It's still happening right now. Different industries, different products, same playbook. Find the scientists, fund the review, shape the conclusion, bury the disclosure. And if anyone questions it, point to the credentials. And the infrastructure is still standing. Walk through that grocery store again. The low-fat section is still there. Fat-free labels are still on products that compensate with sugar. The 2015 dietary guidelines finally acknowledged that added sugar was a problem and recommended limiting it to less than 10% of daily calories. 2015, 48 years after the rigged Harvard review. Nearly half a century to partially correct a fraud. That was 1967. And the sugar industry is still funding nutrition research right now. A 2020 analysis found that Coca-Cola alone had funded over 900 studies between 2008 and 2016. The playbook hasn't changed. The disclosures got a little better. The influence didn't. The Sugar Association's official response to the 2016 Kearns paper was essentially that disclosure standards were different in the 1960s. Not that they were wrong. Not that they regretted it, not that they were sorry, just that the rules about telling people who paid for your research were different back then. as if the problem was paperwork and not the deliberate corruption of science that changed how an entire civilization eats. In 2009, a pediatric endocrinologist named Robert Lustig gave a lecture called Sugar, the Bitter Truth. It's been viewed over 24 million times. Lustig had independently reached the same conclusions Yudkin published 4 decades earlier. When Yudkin's book was reprinted in 2012, it was called A Prophecy. 40 years too late to save his reputation. So what do you do with all of this? You've just spent the last 25 minutes learning how an entire country's diet was redesigned based on corrupted science. You've seen the names, the payments, the documents, and the consequences. I'm not going to tell you to quit sugar. I'm not going to give you a meal plan. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I have clean hands either. I eat this stuff too. We all do. The system is that thorough. But I want you to do one thing. Just one. Next time you're at the store, pick up a product that says low fat on the front. Anything. Yogurt, crackers, salad dressing. Flip it over. Look at the sugar content. Then pick up the regular version, the one without the low fat label. Compare. You're going to see something that will annoy you. The low fat version almost always has more sugar, sometimes a lot more. And that's not some nutritional trade-off a food scientist reluctantly made in a lab. That is the direct, traceable, documented consequence of 3 men at Harvard accepting money from the Sugar Research Foundation in 1965 and writing a review that told the world fat was the problem and sugar was fine. Every low-fat label in that store is a fossil of that lie. Every one. You can't undo what was done to the food supply. You can't retrain your palate overnight. You can't unread the dietary guidelines that shaped 40 years of American eating. And honestly, even knowing the full story, you're probably going to keep buying some of these products. Because they're everywhere. Because they're what you grew up on. Because your brain prefers them. But you can see it now. And once you see it, every trip to the grocery store feels different. Every nutrition label reads differently. Every time someone says eat low fat, you hear the echo of a 1966 letter from a sugar industry executive to a Harvard professor. That yogurt you had this morning. The one with the low-fat label and the picture of strawberries on the front. 7 teaspoons of sugar in a single serving. Formulated to hit your bliss point. Sold to you as a healthy choice. Based on guidelines written by a scientist who was paid by the sugar industry and never told a soul. They got you. Now you know how.